Hello everyone and welcome back to TowerGate. It is TowerGate day number 1150, 1150, June the 3rd, 2020, Wednesday. Thank you so much for tuning in. Of course, it is Wednesday, and you know that every Wednesday I take out the trash and I have some chicken. So I will be taking out the trash. Haven't really decided on what type of chicken it's going to be tonight, but I'll figure that out in a little while. But it will be chicken. Now, let's go ahead and get to the news of the day. It looks like the D.C. Circuit Court will hear oral arguments in the Flynn case on Friday, June the 12th at 9:30 a.m. Now, Sidney Powell was on Lou Dobbs. I don't know how many of you saw that segment, but from what I could tell in her conversation with Lou Dobbs, Sidney Powell seems to suggest that the D.C. Circuit Court could put the kibosh on this thing in those hearings. I don't know if it's just one hearing or follow-up hearings, or if a decision is made that day, or if a decision is made following the hearings. I don't really know. But I wasn't really sure if the D.C. Circuit Court was going to make a ruling, or if they were just going to have a hearing and then refer it back to the DOJ. But from what Sidney Powell is saying, if I understood her correctly, the D.C. Circuit Court does and will actually make that determination at those hearings. So that is good news, because it should end right there. This whole thing should end right there. It should not go any farther. I think the Department of Justice, the letter they wrote makes it perfectly clear about Article 2 and Article 3. We know that the judge cannot simply bring a case. He's not a prosecutor. I don't know what other justification there could be other than what we've heard Sullivan say, which is kind of like psychobabble. It's not really, you got to wonder, if he's maybe a little, senile or a little Alzheimer's or something. I don't know what, but clearly he's not sharp in his mind. He may have been at one time, but he's not there now. But the good news, from what I took away from the Sidney Powell interview, is that this D.C. Circuit Court on Friday, June the 12th, which would be this upcoming, not this coming Friday, but the following Friday, they can, at some point, either at the end of those hearings or maybe following those hearings, they can put the kibosh on this whole plot by Judge Sullivan, in which case he would be extremely embarrassed. But, I'm starting to think that, he's nearing retirement. Maybe he's thinking about retiring, and he'll go out of this a hero either way. I mean, he can be completely embarrassed. The D.C. Circuit Court could say, yeah, you have no standing whatsoever, Judge Sullivan. This thing's over. You can either dismiss this case, or we can remove you from the case and have another judge come in and dismiss the case. The DOJ does not want to prosecute, and the Flynn team and his attorney have decided they're good with that. So, therefore, you don't have anything else to say. And, again, I think that it's very possible that Judge Sullivan is just, I think he realizes that he will be a hero to the left in doing so. And maybe that's what all this is about. We don't know about the private conversations Judge Sullivan has and who he has them with. But clearly, he associates himself, or obviously thinks along the lines of a lot of the leftists, anti-constitutionalists, and those who like a little tyranny in their form of government. And so I can only assume that he's doing this not because he thinks it will succeed, but because he can possibly even look like a martyr who is defending the great cause, and that he will be held up as a hero to the left, which may endear him into some kind of a position after he leaves the court, which could make him a lot of money, or make sure that he stays in with the, his peers in the group or groups that he associates with. It's the only thing I can think of. There's not really a legal win here. There's not a professional win here. This could only be a win for Judge Sullivan if it's something having to do with him, being able to keep up his membership in the tyrannical left and not to be blackballed from the group. They can pat him on the back and say, yeah, you got shut down by the D.C. court, but you fought for the cause, brother. And that's probably what's going through his mind, assuming he still has, reasonable amount of control over his mind, which I think is in question at this point. So let's hope it all comes to an end next Friday. And I don't think I have an issue with the D.C. Circuit Court. I think from what we've already seen from them, the way they've responded to this, and we know that at least 2 of those judges are likely to be sane, that the decision is either going to be 2-1 or 3-0, and they're going to suggest to or order one of the two, Sullivan, to dismiss the case, or they'll dismiss him. So I think that that's what we're looking at, and let's hope that that is exactly what happens, and that this thing is brought to an end, hopefully next Friday. Now, of course, today we have Rodenstein testifying in front of Lindsey Graham's committee. We're going to find out a lot by the end of today about whether or not Lindsey Graham is actually going to do the real hearings. And a way that we're going to know that, and what I'm looking for, Rodenstein has already given us an idea of what his, position is going to be when he goes for this so-called hearing. He wrote that, I don't know what you call it, but he wrote that little summary or whatever that was published in the paper a couple of days ago, where he used the line, even, good professional law enforcement people make mistakes. Now, this is what I'll be keying in on. Is Lindsey Graham going to allow all these people to come before him and simply make the argument that it was just a bunch of good guys who made some mistakes? Now, if Lindsey Graham or any other Republican on the committee allows Rodenstein and others to come in front of his committee and just say, yeah, man, we sure made a lot of mistakes. Boy, we sure screwed this one up. We were well intended, and we didn't break any laws. We were pursuing the investigation, but it appears that we got it wrong. We're good guys, good cops, who just made a mistake. Everyone makes mistakes. Let's hope to God that that is not what these hearings turn into. Because if I see this occur on day one with Rodenstein, I will just say, man, cancel the hearings. The other 20, 30 people you're going to bring in, don't need to hear from them. Because I already can see exactly what this is. There is no way that Graham or any other Republican on that committee can allow Rodenstein to make that argument. We've heard a similar thing from Andy McCabe. That appears to be his defense also, and probably all their defenses. I mean, they can't defend what they did. They did it. We have the evidence. Now the only thing they can do is the motive, because the motive is going to be where the crimes are going to be. Was this a series of accidents through incompetence or whatever else, or was this intentional? And I don't see how in the world Rodenstein can say it was an accident that he signed off on the FISA. An accident that he spoke with Mueller 16 or 18 times from May 10th to May 17th. In that 7-day period, he speaks to Mueller, 16 to 18 times before appointing him as special counsel. When in fact, by no later than the end of January of 2017, 3 months before Rodenstein appointed Mueller, they knew the dossier was completely debunked. They knew that Flynn was completely exonerated, that there was no crime. They knew that the whole thing was a hoax. What is Rodenstein going to say? I didn't get the information? Well, the reason that you have the reason that you sign off and you have someone sign off on that under sworn testimony on this affidavit is that they are verifying that the information is true. Rodenstein was responsible for making sure that the information in the application he signed was true. He is going to try to make it sound like when it comes to him, it's just a rubber stamp. And then when you call up the guy below him and say to him the same thing, he's also going to say, well, I was counting on the people below me. You know, to me, I'm just a rubber stamp. And then you call up the guy under him, and he says, yeah, well, you know, hey, we rely on these people below us. I'm just a rubber stamp. We cannot allow that to happen. If Lindsey Graham allows this to happen in those hearings, it's going to hit the fan. I'm going to be throwing shit. I'm going to be furious. No, none of them signatures were intended to be a rubber stamp. They're intended to be a confirmation that the application has been thoroughly vetted and is true. That's what they're signing. And regardless, they are liable. When you sign a contract or a legal document, you can't come back later and say, well, you know, I made a mistake. I shouldn't have signed the document. I really didn't read it. I didn't have my attorney read through it. I just assumed everything was cool. I just went ahead and signed it. I'm not a bad guy. I just made a mistake. No, we can't have that. And when you take a look at all the other things that Rodenstein was involved in, he was involved in everything. It's not just signing off on that last Carter Page FISA warrant. He's also the one that told even Matt Whitaker and members of Congress, no, you cannot have the documents and witnesses you're requesting. If you do continue to request these things, you will be guilty of obstructing the Mueller investigation. Rodenstein knew the whole time that this is going on, that the entire thing was a fraud. This is the point that they must make, no matter what excuse he tries to give. They must continue to go back to the fact that the information was there, proving this was all a fraud. And if Rodenstein or others below him were negligent in doing their job by making sure that they reviewed the documents, which would verify whether or not the information was correct, they're liable. If they allow him to use the, oh, we just made a few mistakes line, I'm done with that. I have a lot more confidence in Ron Johnson. I don't think Ron Johnson and that committee will allow themselves to be played like that. But Lindsey Graham, remember, he scheduled these hearings perfectly with his election situation, with his, with the politics of his reelection, the timing. It's what this is all about for Lindsey Graham. I don't think he wants to get to the bottom of anything, personally. I could be wrong. I hope he proves me wrong. But I just haven't seen anything from him that would lead me to believe otherwise. I'll be watching very closely. So yes, they cannot allow Rodenstein to continue essentially the cover-up. And I'm sure that Durham's people and Barr will be watching very closely. So I expect one of two things really will come out of Rodenstein's hearing. Either at the end of the day, we're going to find out whether this is a continuation of the big cover-up and they're going to let Rodenstein get away with it and they're going to help him, or is it going to be the first step of the big reveal? Again, after you look at Rodenstein's statement that he made about, well, we just made a lot of mistakes, even good cops make mistakes, well, that doesn't sound like to me like he's ready to do the big reveal. That sounds like to me he's ready to continue the big cover-up. And this is what has to be exposed in these hearings. You cannot let this guy come sit before that committee and then walk out of there at the end of the day feeling literally and looking exonerated because he wasn't held to account. The negligence or the good cops just made a few mistakes sort of thing, they cannot allow that to ride. There was overwhelming evidence, and the decision to launch, an investigation, which certainly looks like a coup attempt into a president, that's not something you guess about. Before you make that decision, you better look at every damn document there is. You better make absolutely sure, 100% sure, that you got your ducks in a row. You can't drop the ball and make a mistake on something this big. And that's why I'm sure they did not. And I'm not buying it. And they better not let Rodenstein sit there and get away with that. Now, he will never come clean, in my opinion, nor will any of these people. But you don't let him sit there and lie to you and then just accept it. At the very least, if Rodenstein drops this kind of garbage and tries to lie and obfuscate the facts and the truth, you have to call him out. You have to look at him and say, Mr. Rodenstein, I don't believe what you're telling me. I don't believe it was a series of accidents. Too much information. And on something this big, you can't make those types of mistakes. So I don't believe you. Now I know why you're sitting here telling me that, because the consequences of what you were involved in are very serious and will likely put you in federal prison. But I'm not buying your your line, and it sounds like you're continuing what's already a cover-up. And at the end of these hearings, I'm going to make a criminal referral against you. So, I mean, you got to call this guy out. You cannot let him get away with anything. If he sees that he's going to be able to make these sort of statements and he's not going to be challenged, it's over as far as I'm concerned. And you can expect that every witness who comes after him is going to do the same thing and get the same treatment. It's just going to be a big show. And that will be absolutely infuriating to me if that happens, based on all the evidence at hand. And I certainly do expect that someone better ask him about the 25th Amendment coup and the wearing a wire. As well as I'd like to know more about that meeting that he had with Mueller in Trump's office, of whether or not that was a job interview, and whether or not there was anything going on with leaving Mueller's cell phone behind. There's a lot of questions I'd have for Rodenstein, and I'm very eager to see exactly how this goes. And, with Lindsey Graham running the show, I don't have, consider me at this point, I'll be surprised if they actually hold Rodenstein's chestnuts to the fire. I'll be surprised. Now, on the Ron Johnson committee, I expect that they will actually, do the right thing here. But the Lindsey Graham show, let's wait and see. It looks very political to me. George Floyd. Remember him? I think most people have forgotten. Half the people who are involved in the rioting don't even know who the hell he is or why they're rioting. It's just a reason to go steal some shit and act up. Let's keep one thing in mind about Mr. Floyd. He came in contact with the police that day because he had just committed a crime, or alleged to have committed a crime. He has a right to due process. He's innocent till proven guilty, so at this time we have to say he's not guilty of that crime, but he was certainly believed to have committed a crime, and that crime is counterfeiting. Now, he apparently passed a phony $20 bill. Now, what's this tell us about this man? Well, it tells us he's pretty stupid, because if you're in the counterfeiting game, you don't counterfeit a $20 bill and then personally go hand it to a cashier, knowing good and well that you're on camera. No, if you have brains in your head, you print out about $500,000 of counterfeit bills and then you launder them. And then by the time the money is in the system and they're finding it showing up in various places around the country or a certain part of the country, you're already in Aruba sucking on a Mai Tai. And you've cashed out. And the money has been laundered so thoroughly that they'll never get to the bottom of it. By the time they do, you'll probably be dead. So this guy obviously is pretty stupid. If you're, a counterfeiter, this is not how you would go about doing it. But we can also see that, so in other words, had Mr. Floyd not committed a crime, a felony, or be alleged to have committed a crime or a felony of counterfeiting, he never would have been in contact with the police. And when you look at his criminal record, we can see that he served 5 years for assault and robbery. That was involving a firearm as well. A violent crime. 5 years for assault and robbery. 2 years before that, he was convicted of charges ranging from theft with a firearm, and I believe in that particular case, he actually went into a private home with a firearm and robbed a homeowner with the firearm. That's also a violent crime. He also had multiple drug charges, and now we know from his toxicology report he had methamphetamine and fentanyl in his system. We also know that he had heart disease. So he wasn't a healthy man. He was obviously a drug addict or a drug user. He obviously has a history of violent crime. And this is supposedly why we're rioting? This guy was probably on his way to jail. And remember, counterfeiting is prosecuted by the Department of the Treasury, Secret Service. They're the ones who, now they typically will turn over to the FBI for the actual prosecution, but it's the Secret Service who deals with things like counterfeiting. And they are under the Department of the Treasury, or at least they used to be. I don't know if they still are. They used to be, certainly. And then, of course, the Department of Justice prosecutes the crime. And even though it was only $20, it's still a felony, because counterfeiting is a felony. So I don't know how much time he would have been looking at, but this guy was on his way to jail anyway. So in other words, we're not talking about an angel here. We're not talking about an angel. We're talking about a guy with a violent criminal history, who's at the very least, a drug user, possibly an addict, who was in the process of committing the crime, which is what led to his contact with the cop. This doesn't justify the cop murdering him at the scene of the crime, or at least that's what it looks like on the video. All the evidence has not yet come out, but there now is evidence that there's evidence that goes both ways. There's a story out there, I don't know if it's true, that in fact Mr. Floyd worked with a rogue cop for 6 or 7 years at a security job. There's also a story out there. There's another story, if I can remember what this is, that the cop was following a procedure that's actually in the training manual for cops in the state of Minnesota. That the technique that he used is actually in the training manual. And supposedly, some cop has posted that, where you can read it, where it actually describes how you put your neck on the artery right here, and that's a technique that they're actually trained to use. These factors will all come into play at some point. And we're going to find out, just like with a lot of these other riots, like the Michael Brown hands up, don't shoot incident, where that turned out to be something completely different than what it initially looked like. And with a lot of these cases that we see, that the initial reaction to them, before all the facts have come in, have people behaving in a certain way, and then once we get the facts and everything's aired out, we find out that things were not exactly what they appeared to be initially. Turns out Michael Brown was reaching for that cop's gun and was going to try to shoot him with his own gun when he reached in the car. We will have to wait and see. Again, when you look at the video, it does not look good, and this is the court of public opinion. But in the court of law, other things will come into play. And we'll wait and see whether or not, well, I'm not going to use the word justified, but we will see whether or not all this rioting and destruction of property and all the things that we're seeing coming from the mob was, I'm not going to use the word justified, but rationalized. And I'm thinking it's not going to be. I'm thinking it's a major overreaction once again. And, you know, the problem is that once the facts come out and prove that the original narrative was incorrect, you never get the correction. The correction never comes. And so the narrative lingers until the next event. So we now are operating on about a half a dozen narratives that were false, that has led to the current narrative we're now using, all based on previous events, which all turned out to be false. A lot of what's happening is based on false narratives, because they never get corrected. Because who would have to correct them? The media, and they're totally corrupted. It's a big problem. It looks like the governor in North Carolina has now refused to allow the Republicans to have a full convention on their terms. He is going to try to impose on them all sorts of restrictions. So it looks like right now that the RNC convention will not take place in North Carolina, and that it looks like they're probably shopping for another state where they can have the Republican convention. Where that's going to be, I don't know. Florida, Georgia, I've heard, are both candidates. So we'll just have to see, but it looks like the Republican National Convention is not going to be in North Carolina, because they're not going to capitulate to the governor there and his rules for, you know, what they have to do at the convention based on so-called coronavirus. So it looks like the RNC convention is not going to be in North Carolina. We'll see who actually gets the convention. And it's going to be quite entertaining watching the Republican convention where everybody's, you know, normal, and watching the Democratic convention, which is likely going to be people walking around 6 feet away with masks on, everything marked out, people sitting 6 feet away. It's going to make for a really strange looking event, whereas the Republican event will look more like an actual convention. So I think we're going to see a quite humorous contrast when we finally get down to the conventions, which are only about 2.5 months away. Well, the 82nd Airborne has arrived in the District of Criminals, and they brought along with them their Blackhawks and Chinooks. Chinooks are primarily used to transport troops and equipment, large numbers of troops and equipment. They're the big helicopters. They're really loud, and they're the ones with the big 2 rotating blades on top. I flew in a Chinook one time. Usually we used the Chinooks, when I was in the Army, we used the Chinooks for our trucks and our Jeeps and our generators. And we didn't use them too much for troops, but I was on one time with a large number of troops. So they can be used as troop carriers, but they're generally not good for troop carriers because they're very, very noisy. You can hear a Chinook coming long before you can see the Chinook. You can hear the Chinook. Not good if you're trying to ferry some troops into a hot zone. You really don't want the enemy hearing you coming a mile away. The Blackhawks and some of the Hueys and things like that are much better because they fly faster, they're smaller, they have some armor. They don't carry nearly as many people, but at least you'll get them there and get them on the ground safely. You can rappel out of them and things and such. So it looks like that the 82nd Airborne is on the ground. That's good, but I still feel like there needs to be a much heavier, I want to see a full-blown military response. You've got the 10th Mountain Division up there in New York, Fort Drum. You've got the 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, in Fort Riley, Kansas, where I unfortunately spent about a year and 10 months of my life. Then you've got the 3rd Division out there in Fort Ord, California. You have large military units in Fort Hood. You have other units across the U.S. That can be deployed into the action. But the guys coming out of Fort Bragg are the best of the best. That's where your paratroopers, rangers, and special forces come out of. So these are definitely the best of the best on the ground in D.C. You got to protect the Capitol. But I would have military units, and I'm telling you, this weekend coming up, I expect these riots are going to be worse next weekend because they're not being tamped down. They're literally not being tamped down, and so I don't think we can do another weekend. And I honestly believe that Trump would benefit politically in a huge way, because even most Democrats in these cities that are under siege are sick of it. They want to see this stuff put down, and their liberal Democratic governors and mayors will not do it. I think if the president asserts himself and sends in the federal forces, the military, and puts down the riots, I think he will benefit greatly politically from this. Obviously, it's a very sensitive situation and operation, not just for the president, but also for the troops. I can tell you that American soldiers are not generally thrilled about the idea that they may be deployed on the streets of America to be in combat with fellow Americans. But when the people on the ground that you're dealing with are taking part in an operation to destroy the country, they then become the enemy combatant. And the enemy can be both foreign and domestic. And in this case, it is domestic. So I think as long as the soldiers are given the correct information and they truly understand that this is not the average American that they're engaged with, but it's the average American they're trying to defend their cities, their businesses, and their private property, and they understand that this Antifa group are not your normal group of, say, Americans. They're anti-American, quite honestly, and they are the enemy. I think that they need to make sure that troops clearly understand. And the tricky part about this, and again, I was involved in the same type of operations, it's very tricky when you have 4 or 5 different groups and you're trying to sort them out. And that's the same situation we would run into. They'd throw us into a group of 10,000 crazy-ass protesters. We had to decide, is this guy in front of me, is he just a peaceful protester here along for the ride, for the entertainment or whatever, or is he a true believer, does he really believe in the cause, or is he a paid operative? And at the time when I was in Germany and we were running into this, we had a very bad group of folks called the Red Army Faction. They had been blowing up military bases, discos. You can Google this for yourself, and you'll see, just type in Red Army Faction, you'll see on the Google search that during the period of the early to mid-'80s, this terrorist group being paid by the East Germans and the Russians were targeting places where American GIs would hang out, but that were owned by foreign nationals. There were bombings. They were threatening to bomb cars. In fact, even when I came back from Germany at that time, we were not even allowed to travel in military uniform. They made us put on civilian clothes and asked us to try to blend in as much as possible. When we got to the airport, they had the plane parked completely out in the far end of the airport. They wouldn't even let it come up to the terminal. They bussed us out there in a double-decker bus and loaded the bus and loaded the plane and fueled the plane out there. Because of the terrorist threats. And when we got in there that morning to the airport, we had to get out of the car, and they did bomb-sniffing dogs and everything. And I was in civilian clothes, but my platoon sergeant and a couple of my buddies who were with me came to the airport with me to send me off. They were in military uniform. So, yes, it's very, very tricky, but it's a tough job sometimes, but that's when you call in the military. These guys will get it done. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'll be back tomorrow with more TowerGate. See you. Bye.